All right, welcome everyone. It's really good to see all these people coming in. It's good to see you here today, and thank you for coming. For those of you who might be new to QualME, Ideal's Qualitative Monitoring and Evaluation Peer Community, my name is Robin Al-Haddad, and I am a research associate with Tango International. I'm based in Tucson, Arizona, and I'm the community manager for QualME. I'm happy to be welcoming you all here today. This is our second QualME event, an info session on qualitative study design decisions. So please introduce yourself in the chat box. If everyone could introduce yourself and share your name, your organization, the position where you're based, and please just put that into the chat. Also, before we get started, I just want to welcome anyone who's a French speaker. Just to inform you that we will be providing French interpretation during the meeting. So please click on the globe at the bottom, the interpretation globe at the bottom of your screen, and you can select your preferred language there. Unfortunately, this feature is not available if you're connecting from your phone, or it won't be available in the breakout room sessions. But if you're a French speaker, please use the chat to let my colleague Suzanne Baracus know so that you can be placed into a breakout group that has the French interpreter in that group to help support your needs. And okay, and also some other quick technical instructions. Just as a quick reminder, please. A few rules to remember. Please mute your microphone when you're not speaking so that we're not hearing any background noises. You can use that chat box to raise your hand, or use the raise the hand button, or just physically raise your hand if you have a question, and we will try to answer your question or try to get to as many questions as we can. We will be recording this session. We've already started recording, so you may have seen a quick pop-up that asks you for permission to record. And just also to introduce you to QualME. QualME is a community, where that's meeting. We have meetings that are held once a quarter, and each meeting has a different topic of discussion. And today's meeting is going to focus on study design decisions and best practices and innovative approaches to doing mixed method design studies. This meeting is really just intended to give a brief overview of design challenges and best practices. We also have other upcoming events that you can kind of keep your eye out for. We have an event coming up in June, and that is implementing qualitative M&E. It's going to be around data collection tools, field logistics, and scorecards. Another event will happen in September 2022. This is going to be around complexity in data analysis, mixed method analysis, and data visualization. Today, we're going to hear from our colleagues from Tango International and also Helen Keller International. And after a short plenary discussion, we will break out into small breakout groups for discussion that will be facilitated by our QualME community leaders and core group members. I'd also like just to take a moment to introduce Alpha and Lovu. Maybe Alpha, if you could turn on your camera and wave your hand. And Shamiso Moyo, also Shamiso, if you can also kind of raise your hand. These are our QualME community leaders, our co-community leaders. So I'd like to welcome them and introduce you to them. Okay. So now we're going to turn it over to our presenters to share their experiences and resources that they have found useful in their research. First, I'm going to welcome Karen Fox, who will be presenting on the QUIPS. This is BHA's Qualitative Inquiry Planning Sheet. It's a tool that can be used to help you sort of think through the design process. And Karen is a senior research advisor at Tango International. She's been a fixture here for over 20 years, and she's currently a qualitative M&E specialist with the Ideal Award. Her training is in international agricultural development and ecological and cultural anthropology, and her most recent work includes mixed method impact evaluations of resilience activities and outcome monitoring in Ethiopia, Kenya, Zimbabwe, and where she focuses on the qualitative components. In 2017, she started working with M&E colleagues at USAID's former Office for Food for Peace, which is now called the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance, or BHA, and to support the integration of qualitative methods into M&E for USAID funded activities. So now I'm going to send it over to you, Karen.
Great. Thanks, Robin. Let's see, is everything working here? Can you hear me all right?
Yeah, I can hear you.
There we go. Okay. Super. Well, thank you again, and thanks to everyone for joining. We are so excited to get this qualitative group together now on a, as Robin explained, a quarterly basis to talk about qualitative methods for monitoring and evaluation. We have, as Robin suggested, taken input from the qualitative peer community and tried to identify what some of the key interest points are. And really, this is about me giving a little bit of an overview and then hearing from our implementers, HKI, the Sapling Award in Bangladesh, and then really having time for all of us to share our ideas and experience, because we know that all of you are out there doing different types of qualitative inquiry, and we want to hear from you, how you're making these decisions and what you're learning. So with that, I'm just going to jump right in with my new favorite. See, Suzanne, if you could click ahead for me, the chat storm. And I admit I'm a little bit new to chat storms, but I've taken a liking to them. So the idea is that I'll pose a question to you. If you could take a moment, like 30 seconds, write a quick response in the chat box. And when I say go, hit the send button, and we can see what comes out of our collective thinking here. Okay, so here we go. So when you think of qualitative study, when someone says the words qualitative M&E, what's the very first thing that jumps to your mind? Take a few moments here, and don't hit go till I say go. I guess that's the storm part of this. No worries, Mara. Okay, just another couple of seconds and go. What do we get? FGDs, interviews, FGDs, in depth, perspectives, understanding hard topics. Yes. Key informant interviews. Yes. Everyone can see these chats storming in here. Narratives, long discussions. Observations, yes. Case studies. Why and how questions. Thank you, iPhone. Analyzing texts. Role plays. Okay, I think we have some more chats storming in, but if we can go ahead and click to the next slide. Because yes, these are all marvelous ideas. And what I loved the most is that there were a lot of responses that said FGDs, key informant interviews, and interviews. And that's in part why we wanted to have this session. Because I think often when we hear qualitative inquiry, it's the first thing that often comes to mind is that key informant interview or a focus group discussion. And what we really want to try to do in this session is think back, is kind of step back a little bit and think about qualitative research as a whole design process. I know many of us involved in M&E put a lot of time and thought into designing our quantitative M&E, the indicators we're going to measure, how we're going to measure them, how we're going to analyze them, and how we're going to use them. And with qualitative, it's the exact same thing. I think we often tend to sort of jump right in and say, where's the tool, right? We want that topical outline. But what we want to do in this session, again, is just step back and think about, reflect on, and hear from all of you. What are the choices that you make from the very beginning? So that's why we've called this bit of the session Qualitative M&E by Design. So it's really all about thinking through those design steps for qualitative monitoring and evaluation. And it's driven by the first checkpoint here, the purpose and the research questions. Often, we're all involved in different activities. We want to know, like, why is this working or why is this not working? Why are people in this community able to come together and collectively ensure access to water or start a new vegetable garden that's giving them income at the local market? Why is it happening here and not there? Just as one example. So that's a question, but not necessarily the research question. All right, the research question is more about building an hypothesis, and people in this community have greater collective action, perhaps because they have more access to markets or information, whatever it may be. And those research questions have to be informed by our secondary literature review, as well as kind of an assessment, as we're all doing out in the field of collecting information on the ground. So one of our topics today is focused on secondary information and how important that is in guiding the development of those research questions, because the research question needs to fill a gap that's unknown and may be very specific to a particular project in a particular context, but often has broader ramifications. But the most important thing is that that research question, it drives the rest of the study. Because qualitative M&E, as you know, is all about making decisions. And those decisions, at each decision point, we need to come back to our research questions and our purpose and think, is this the right method to answer that question? Is this the right way to analyze our data to answer this question? Oh, next slide, please. So again, that purpose and research question leads right into the design and methodology choices that we're going to make. What kind of data are we going to use? Sampling is so critical in qualitative work and often something that we tend to overlook. How are we going to collect the right information from the right group of people, right population? Who are we going to talk to? What are the criteria that we're going to use? So if we have good sampling built in and good selection criteria, that'll help guide the rest of the study and the information that we're collecting. So similarly, the data collection tools, again, that's often what we first jump into. What are the data collection tools? What are the questions we want to ask? Do we want to use most significant change? I think someone had mentioned in the chat box. We want to use case studies, role plays. But really that decision about what method and what tool to use, again, goes right back to the research question. Similarly, data recording, how we analyze the data and how we report it and use it. We got to think about that from the beginning, not at the end. And that's often what happens, right? Like we have all this, so we've got a good study, we've identified who we're going to talk to, we have tools, we go out, we have great focus groups, key informant interviews, observations, record that data, and then what do we do with it? So it's really important to think through that analysis phase from the very beginning. Next slide, please. And then we have these other key components, right? How are we actually going to do this? What's the feasibility? Do we have access to the places where we need to collect information? Do we have the resources that we need to do it? And those kinds of questions are very much going to guide the decisions we make about how many people we can interview over what time frame. And then making sure that we're training appropriately. Again, often our training tends to jump right into the tool and the logistics. But we find that the more time we spend with our research teams, really going over and understanding those research questions, we like to say, eat the research questions. You have to eat it, and then you have to eat your topical outline. And once you fully ingested that, and everyone on the team is on the same page and understanding what are the real questions we want to understand, then those data collection moments, those interviews, can really flow in more of that organic, natural way. And we can get to that magic that we all strive for in doing our qualitative work. Of course, we've also highlighted here ethical review, critical, and often that, as we know, goes back to the ethical review requirements from the organizations we work with, from our donors, and also from the countries in which we're working. So next slide, please. So just a few things to highlight as we're thinking about that sort of qualitative study protocol. So I just outlined the series of basic steps, kind of those minimum best practices and things to think about from the top. Now it's a series of steps. Probably should have put it into more of one of those keen PowerPoint cycles, because really those are non-linear iterative steps. So each decision that you make about your sampling is going to refer backwards and forwards, right? So how you sample is going to also influence the types of tools that you're using and where you're doing the data collection. And they're referencing back to your research questions. So they're not exactly kind of 1, 2, 3, check the box, but it's like this constant process of checking and rechecking, which, excuse me, again, leads us to that, there's no magic formulas, right? We don't have any sampling formula that we can plug in to understand or to make decisions about how many people we're going to interview. Rather, each stage of that protocol and each stage in the data collection process in particular is part of this series of really dynamic decisions, again, that go back to the research questions. Does this decision get us the answers that we have set out to identify? Do the methods that you're choosing or the tools that you're choosing, do they fit well in terms of responding to the overall purpose? Is it feasible? I mean, often we have a desire to collect a lot of data, right? Always unanswered questions. But what's the feasibility of that? Not just for the data collection process, but for the data analysis. As we know in qualitative work, sometimes less is more. And by that, I'm referring to depth versus breadth. So better to have fewer interviews with kind of deeper information. As we're making these decisions at each stage of kind of that protocol or design process, it's important that we document and then also justify that decision-making process. So we have an initial protocol that we've set out. These are the tools we're going to use. These are the people we're going to talk to. This is how we're going to analyze the data. But we all know from experience doing qualitative work that, and one of the gifts of qualitative work is the flexibility that we have. But as we're taking advantage of that flexibility, it's important that we're making documentation of that, and that we can communicate that when we're sharing our findings. So our decision-making process is very clear. And importantly as well, data quality assurance, DQA, something that we need to keep in mind from the very beginning right to the end. I think sometimes we come in with the DQA after that data has been collected and we're sort of looking through the results and initiating that analysis process. But really, at each stage of the design process and the decision-making process, it's important to just pause and say, is this decision ensuring rigorous, qualitative evidence-based qualitative data? So next slide, please. So as Robin said, I wanted to use this time to introduce a tool that's been developed by the Bureau of Humanitarian Assistance. And on the right-hand side, you'll see a number of topics that refer right back to the design decision process that I described earlier. So this is the QIPS, the Qualitative Inquiry Planning Sheet. I also recently learned that it's the name of a toothbrush, so keep that in mind. But the QIPS, essentially it's a simple tool that's used to outline the minimum best practice and then communicate that. So those of us, or communicate that to our stakeholders and to BHA. So it's not necessarily a protocol per se, but those of us who are implementing USAID BHA funded activities, and RIFSs in particular, this is a tool that's known and familiar among our BHA colleagues, and something that they seek to receive, so that there's good communication, and that decision-making process about qualitative M&E kind of starts from the beginning, before the inquiry actually begins. With that, I want to go ahead and I can't take credit for this. I want to just briefly introduce a couple of colleagues we have online today. I'm Hillary Cook, a BHA M&E advisor, and Nancy Peak, a regional M&E advisor for East Africa, who's based in Ghana, and Hillary in DC. So if you could just turn on your cameras just briefly, so folks know who you are. Nope, there's Robin.
Hi, I don't think my camera is going on right now, but I'm Hillary Cook. It's nice to see everyone here. Thanks for being here. Thanks, Karen.
Thanks for being here as well, and all your work to get qualitative inquiry prioritized in our M&E systems. So Nancy, I'm not sure if you're online, but I just wanted to, again, recognize the work of Hillary and Nancy and colleagues at BHA to really integrate the qualitative inquiry into M&E systems. And you're going to be online as resource people. So if we have questions, we can come back to you, Hillary. Thanks so much. Next slide, please. Okay, so I just wanted to highlight as well some of the guidance that BHA has helped to develop. I think these are some of the recent M&E guidance, policy and guidance documents for BHA, both for the emergency programs as well as the resilience activities. So there are links in the slide deck, and within these documents, you'll find some references and guidance for integrating qualitative M&E into your programming, as well as in Annex 5 of the non-emergency or RIFTA guidance, you'll find the QUIPs. Next slide, please. Okay, so with that, I wanted to close with just a final chat storm as we shift into a really great example from our Helen Keller colleagues with the Sapling Award about using qualitative together with quantitative methods. I think it's a design question that we receive a lot of questions and interest about, so we wanted to take some time to focus on that. So again, another chat storm. Think about one mixed methods design challenge that you faced. How do you integrate that qual and quant data that you're collecting in your monitoring? And what have you found to be something that's difficult with regard to that? I'm going to give you another 10 seconds or so before we hit go. Okay, 3, 2, 1, go. Oh, lots of challenges. Okay. So limiting the number of topics, bias, that's a really good point. Balancing the qual and quant with the instruments. Oh, having the skill set, that's a good point. And kind of back to that issue of training, right? Where making sure that in that training, we're seeing the difference, that a topical outline isn't a survey, right? That qualitative data collection is very much the art of human interaction. Sampling size, absolutely, and how to mix that qualitative sample with a more statistically rigorous quantitative sample design. The order of things, right? Do they happen simultaneously? Is it iterative? Again, great question. And a lot of these things, if we can think back to what are the initial research questions, it's going to help us solve some of these problems. Okay, these are all really real suggestions. Analysis of findings, yes. All right, so with that, I think we're going to get some insight into how one award has dealt with some of these challenges and made decisions along the way. So I'm going to turn it over, I guess, back over to Rob to introduce our next speaker. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much, Karen. I really love that. We can use our QuIPs toothbrush after we eat our research questions. That was great. I like that. But thank you, Karen, for sharing about the QuIPs tool and also the importance of the whole design process, really. So yeah, and you got some great responses here to your chat question. So thank you. So let's turn it over to our next guest. Our next presenters are Miraz Rahman and Meredith Jackson de Graffenried, who will be presenting on the sapling project in Bangladesh. Miraz is the head of collaboration and learning and adaptation, or CLA, for USAID funded Bandarban Agricultural and Nutrition Initiative, or BANI, B-A-N-I project, which is an extension of the markets and nutrition work of the sapling project began. BANI is being implemented in the remote Chittagong Hill Tracts regions of Bangladesh by Helen Keller International. And as head of the CLA, Miraz is responsible for the CLA plan, engaging critical personnel and stakeholders in project learning and adaptation, assisting technical, administrative, and operational leads to implement CLA for all project areas. And Miraz holds an MA in Applied Medical Anthropology and Graduate Public Health Certificate from New Mexico State University. I also want to welcome Meredith Jackson de Graffenried. She's a global technical advisor for Helen Keller International, and she's currently living in Malawi. She has over 20 years of practical and academic experience in civil society, government, private sector, and academia in Latin America, Asia, Africa, and the US. And she is a biocultural medical anthropologist. Meredith's approach to understanding human health and behavior is grounded in understanding the cultural, social, political, and economic influences on health, decision-making, and psychosocial and other well-being outcomes. As Miraz and Meredith are presenting, please feel free to write your questions in that chat box. They will have an opportunity to answer your questions immediately after their presentation. So now I'm going to hand it over to you, Miraz.
Thank you. Thanks for the introduction, Robin. Good day, everyone. So the presentation we are about to do is about our experience of using qualitative and quantitative research, especially qualitative research for the learning and adaptation in a resilience food security activity. Next slide, please, Robin. So the project we will be talking about is the Sapling Project. It was a 6-year, 31 million USAID BHA funded program, just ended in December 2021. So because Sapling, the project was implemented in the Chittagong Hill Tract region, the southeastern part of Bangladesh, a mountain terrain. So it was the very first time a new area for BHA. So it was a pilot project. And therefore we spent a considerable amount of time learning about the context of our population, and we practiced adaptive management, and we reflected, learned, and adjusted. So as mentioned, Sapling worked in 5 sub-districts in Bangladesh, among 24 unions to municipalities, more than 100,000 participants in more than almost 1,600 villages. We have 48,292 poor and extreme poor households covered, and also roughly 13,000 pregnant and lactating women, and 17,000 children under 2, and almost 12,000 adolescent girls. So what's significant about Sapling is we worked with 10 different distinct ethnic groups. Next slide, please. So as we mentioned earlier, so it was a new area for BHA. We did a considerable amount of research studies. So the formative research we did, we had the baseline surveys. We catered the resilience study from the baseline data. We had the household census, and we had the formative research. And formative research was both qualitative and quantitative, and it was over 2 years period long study. So first, before I go further, I would like to say that formative research is just not qualitative, and it's not just at the beginning of the project. It's iterative, ongoing for learning and adaptation. So it was a massive, massive undertaking for us, knowing about 11 distinct ethnic groups. And there's a wide range of variation in terms of cultures, in terms of language, and social norms and practices. So we covered like urban rural settings, 11 ethnic groups, their access to resources. We had 92 in-depth interviews. We have 532 focus group discussions and other PRAs, which is quite long. And we covered the pregnant lactating mothers, women, adolescent girls and boys, spouses, male spouses, mother-in-law and father-in-laws in our research. So we also had the barrier analysis for exclusive breastfeeding and complementary feeding, and among like 25 doers and non-doers for each category. We also had other studies like WASH FGDs by our partner consultant. We had market and value chain assessment. And also we have our routine participant monitoring annual survey, and also the monthly data we collect. Next slide, please. So few of the key learnings. So I can actually talk the whole day about formative research, but the few of the key findings we found that although the different ethnic groups have belonging to different languages, culture, social norms, they share the experience of poverty, low resilience capacity, and gender and social inequalities, and frequent shocks and stressors, poor natural resource management, lack of diversity and livelihood and asset, limited access to resources. No matter how, whether there was like two different groups like Bengalis and other ethnic indigenous population, regardless of their ethnicity, we found out that women have heavier workloads. No matter how much mobility they enjoy or restricted, they have less access to more valuable assets, resources, and less decision-making powers. So men, in terms of workload distribution, men are viewed as doing the heavier works, paid as twice most of the time than women for the same number of hours, eat better food in the household, just like other places around the world. Men are the head of the households and make final decisions over family matters and valuable assets. We found out that during the pregnancy period, women do not get adequate rest. There are different dietary prescription, which limits the dietary diversity for PLWs. And the exclusive breastfeeding was lower in comparison to other parts of Bangladesh. And at the last, like adolescent girls and adult women often have very restricted mobility, especially during menstruation. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, thank you. So here are some of the pictures of one of our the platform we used for most of our participants, which is called IEHFP, Integrated Enhanced Homestead Food Production, in which we have all in all the communities with all the pregnant and lactating mothers, as well as poor and extreme poor women. So the idea was having a common plot community garden in which which will be owned by one of the participants who will be as the group leader, and sapling provide them input support of seed for 4 seasons. So the idea is we provide them the technical knowledge as well as input, and it's going to improve the food security and nutrition status, as well as enhance the knowledge of the participants. So there was a unique challenge that we faced during 2019 when a massive flood destroyed almost 95% of our community gardens. So since we use it as a platform and we saw it's going to affect the food security at the almost the midway and the last of the project, so we directed our funding. We decided to do conditional cash transfer for rehabilitating those community gardens. And so we went into the communities, collect data to learn more about the situations, and what we found was quite striking and poses great challenges. We found out that, so firstly, we assume that there are indigenous populations, and comparing to other parts of Bangladesh or any other part of the world, since they are seen more in the gardens working side by side with their male counterparts, we also seen them having equal access to market. We assume that they have this equal decision-making power. And we later found out that basically there are some patriarchal, deeply rooted patriarchal norms and patriarchy, which prevented women from owning the land most of the time. Even for the group leaders, they're how they're going to use their land, what are they going to grow, it depends on the male member of their household, so who are basically the owners. So they were not interested, and they're skeptic that like this having those community gardens rehabilitated will help. So this also gives us a great opportunity, and we shifted our intervention based on that piece of information and a lot of research, and we shifted to true community garden, where we use that money and leased out lands for the group of women, where everyone will have, those group of women have the decision-making power, and with the technical assistance from sapling, they would like be able to grow the nutritious food and contribute to the food security, which was quite successful. Next slide, please. Next slide. No, the slide before, sorry. So the slide before, Robin. Yeah. Oh, one more up. Okay, anyway, so there is how we used our qualitative research. There are a few more photos of our beautiful community gardens from different ethnic groups while women are working there. So another thing we found from our annual ARR data, that albeit of having a lot of messaging and project, while we continuously taught our beneficiaries about the use of organic pesticide and use of organic green manure or fertilizer, the intake was quite, the uptake of using organic pesticide and fertilizer was quite low. So what we went into the field to collect more data to understand why, so that we can direct our messaging. And we found out because of the limited fallow period and the population pressure, increasing population pressure, they tend to go towards pesticides, and because it's easier for them. So we have shifted our messaging. We changed it quite a lot in a manner that we focused on the importance of using organic fertilizers in the field, talked about the cost associated with using chemicals, as well as having families being able to, especially children, being able to eat organic food. So that actually helped quite a lot. And we found it out in our later ARR. Next slide, please. Next slide. So one of the things we did during formative research, we developed a qualitative tool, which is called mind mapping. And what we did, we wanted to know a lot more about the feeding practices and the exclusive breastfeeding, since the data from the M&E, it was quite low. So we wanted to delve a little deeper. So what we found out, we asked a series of questions about after a child is born. What are the foods that are given to the child, and what are the milestones, how the parents determine what type of food, why that particular type of food, how frequent, how much, who source it, who gives the decision. And we found out quite a unique data. For example, we found out there's a lot of prelectural feeding that are persistent in the indigenous populations. For example, after a child is born, There are bile of boas, a few drops of alcohols are given to children with the hope that the bile of boa will cure the impurities of the skins. So will the alcohol. We found out that the mothers have to go through some prescription of food. So those actually helped us quite a lot, those qualitative data, to further design our SBCC and target it towards the right audience. So last, what we want to talk about is the how to bridge research and interventions, especially the theory and practices. As we started and mentioning before, that research is not a one-time phenomenon, and it needs to be a part of project cycle. And all the experiences I have shared are from the qualitative research and from the data we collected different types and different times of the projects based on the quantitative and M&E data we found, and we went and investigate. And also, rather than completely put your faith on the traditional development narrative, we always have to go back to participants and put them as your center. We always need to talk about sustainability, think about sustainability while we design an intervention, and also need to share our data with the right audience. And while qualitative research, we use why. We want to know why, what happened, why that happened. Also, please think about so what. So now that you have your data and you know the why, what are you going to do with it? And always revert back to the project goals and objective, and how having this data going to feed into the interventions and how we can tailor the programming. So also we need to know about the power dynamics that our colleagues have talked about the sampling size while we do the sampling for qualitative research, knowing where to collect data from whom. That's going to be very important. And also looking at the theories, those are there to guide us while we design our qualitative research, especially when we are talking about focusing on gender equality and social inclusion, thinking about the feminist pedagogy, adult learning principles, and have those integrated into your research. Next slide, please. So last one, yeah. So also while we do the research or while we design intervention, the research can also take place while we do our intervention at field level. So we have to recognize that our staffs, they also bring their expertise and they also bring their experience of learning. So most of the time, many of the research we found out that most of our sessions were lecture based. So we saw the trend, and we try to again design our sessions more based on adult learning principles. I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Miraz, for sharing about the sapling project. We don't have a lot of time for questions right now. We're kind of running short, but I just wanted to ask a quick question of you. I heard you talk about the process of mind mapping, and I was just wondering if you could elaborate very quickly on that and how you use qualitative and quantitative data together.
So as we mentioned that we had the baseline studies and other household census, so we knew the trend of the complementary feeding and the lower uptake of exclusive breastfeeding. So the mind mapping is basically most of our participants were non-literate. We draw a circle or a baby and we ask them when they feed, what type of food, and what's the rationale, who's feeding, how they're feeding. So for each item, we had the master list and analyzed from there and went a series of questions. Thank you, Robin.
Okay, great. Thank you. I see we have a few other questions in the chat. Unfortunately, we're kind of running short on time. So maybe if we have a chance, we can come back to the questions at the end. But right now, we're going to go into our group discussions, our small groups. We're going to take about 30 minutes to go into breakout rooms. So I want to welcome everyone to share your own examples in the breakout rooms. So we will also report out after our discussion in the breakout rooms. We're going to report out. You will be randomly assigned to a breakout room, and a message will pop up that will let you know which room that you're going to go into. And you'll need to click join the group. In your groups, there are 3 different groups. We're going to break out into room 1. We'll have a question on how can qualitative and quantitative results be combined to tell a story. And that's going to be facilitated by Alpha. In room 2, we have a question on how can we craft appropriate research questions for qualitative studies, and that will be facilitated by Karen. And then we have our 3rd room, which will be how do you find secondary documents and resources to support design decisions, and that will be facilitated by Shamiso. So you should be having a pop-up come here that will put you into a room. And then afterwards, we will all return to our plenary and do a quick report out. Thank you. See, we're all starting to come back from our breakout groups. Let's give it just a second before we get started. Also, I just want to remind those of you who are French speakers, as you're coming in back into this main room, that you'll have to reselect the French language at that globe at the bottom if you need it to get your interpretation. Okay, it looks like we have a good majority of people who are back, so we can go ahead and get started. I'm going to ask all of us to the 3 groups to report back on what your discussions were. So we'll start with Alpha in room 1. If you could, Alpha and Mike, if you guys could please report out and what happened. What was the discussion like?
Okay, yeah, thank you so much, Robin, for the opportunity. In our group, we had a number of questions. The first issue that we discussed was how do we sequence these, the quantitative and the qualitative, how do you sequence them? And also the discussion around that was that probably you want to make sure that your tools also are synchronized so that these speak to each other and you are able to collect data that communicates across both surveys, the qualitative and the quantitative. And the most common order was starting with the quantitative and then going on to the qualitative, where you then be exploring some of the phenomenon that you are observing in the quantitative. Then we also looked at the challenges that people face in quantitative data analysis, in mixed method data analysis, basically. And one of the major challenges that we dwelt upon was the issue of conflicting findings. When you have done your qualitative and quantitative and you find that your results don't speak to each other, how do you then harmonize those two to come up with one story that speaks to the objectives of the survey? Mike, you can add.
Sure, Alpha. So kind of going back to what you were saying about, what comes first, the quantitative or the qualitative, and what a lot of people were saying, that there seems to be sort of this bias that the quantitative research design always seems to come first. And kind of what I was getting from that, what people were saying is that the qualitative is often coming off as a bit of an afterthought. or it's just sort of used as more of a supplemental way to explain the quantitative data, but it isn't necessarily thought of this thing to work in conjunction. And one of the challenges is that people are not thinking of these things in a pair.
Great. Thank you both. Thank you. Let's go over to Karen in room 2. Can you all report out to us quickly?
And I'm going to pass this baton to Matt Click in our group, who will share some key findings. Thanks, Robin.
Hi, good morning, everyone. Yeah, we had a good discussion around formulating research questions. And if I can try to encapsulate the discussion, I'd sort of break it out into in answering how to develop research questions that then drive your research. There are sort of instrumental ways of arriving at that, and then the sort of more philosophical or theoretical reasons. The instrumental ones, Retta, Gudisa from Spear, and Meredith commented on using participant surveys and questions raised by routine monitoring to then further explore. And so the findings or the particularities or the conundrums that arose from those sorts of surveys and the routine monitoring perpetuate a series of research questions. So that's one way. Actually, I should add as well that Jenny raised the idea of the purpose or sort of for whom the questions are or what they're addressing specifically, and there might be different interests on the other side of those questions for whom they speak more specifically. A question may speak more specifically. Then getting at a kind of a number of questions or how to arrive at them, there was general consensus that sort of refinement towards a smaller number, and we actually arrived at the number of 3 specifically for number of research questions came up versus an expansive long list of questions and sub-questions. We recognize that a lot of questions, of course, have sub-components or sub-questions embedded within them, but we sort of agreed that on the back end, those would need exploration and delineation through our answers. But in terms of questions driving us, the power of 3 sort of seemed to come up as a number that was feasible, reasonable, and useful for all parties. It's a brief encapsulation. Please feel free to add to that, anyone from our team.
Great. Thank you so much, Matthew. Let me go over to Shimiso and group 3. Can you all report out for us?
Thanks, Robin. I think we had a great discussion that sort of really flowed. So some organizations rely on, in terms of how you find secondary data documents, they rely on their own internal data, their own surveys. They also rely on published reports from other programs, like within a consortia environment, and learnings as well. And you'll find that in terms of some of the strategies that are used to look for secondary data, there's been using university affiliations in terms of the databases that can be used, drawing on any networks in order to access literature. Somebody mentioned directly emailing the authors, like when you come across an article and you can't access it, you have to pay for it. But at times, if you email the author directly, the author can actually send you their document. So that was quite interesting. So generally looking at, you can also look through different donor websites. Nowadays, different donors have different working groups that are supported technically in terms of the resources that secondary documents that different implementing agencies can draw upon. And there's a lot of rich data. For example, Food for Peace, they have a technical reference library, and it's also being redeveloped, but it still has a comprehensive collection of resources currently that people can tap into. I guess as USAID are a big donor, they do put in a lot of resources that cut across many different thematic areas. So this is one good reference. And there were discussions around the use of gray literature because we often do come across it. There's discussion centered on that it needs to be from trusted sources, partners, programs supported by the same donor, for example, along with reputation of an organization before making a decision to use some of this gray literature. And we also looked at, in terms of secondary documentation, how language can be a barrier to accessing secondary documents, just like cost. So language, you can come across a document, maybe you're an English speaker and you come across a document in Spanish or French, and you can't quite get the translated version of it. Already that leads to some possibly missed information because you're not able to look through that data. So yeah, definitely, if a resource is in a different language, you tend to put it aside and it becomes a missed opportunity. And lastly, there was a need, just lastly, there's a need to establish strong management systems for secondary data within organizations. And this shouldn't just be done along the implementation timeline, but it should be done from design stage so that data is not lost after programs have ended their implementation.
Great. Those are all really great points, especially that one about contacting the author when you come across that paywall. I've done it myself, and I've always gotten authors to respond back. So that's great. But thank you all. Thanks for this great conversation, and to all of our presenters who, Karen and Miraz, thank you so much for your presentation and for taking the time to share your knowledge with all of us. Thank you to Karen, Alpha, and Shamiso for facilitating those breakout room discussions. Unfortunately, it's really time to wrap up today's session. We're running out of time here. But as a final request, I think there has been a link that's been put into your chat. We appreciate if you could follow that link that was posted in the chat to answer a very short evaluation about today's session. And also, if you think that you're interested in joining the QualME peer community group, there's an opportunity to indicate your interest in the QualME group on the evaluation form. We'll be sending up a follow-up email after this event. It will include materials like the video from today's session. We may have some additional resources, the quips and other things that were highlighted during presentations. All those resources will be sent out. And also, I just want to remind everyone quickly that we are having a few other upcoming events. One again in June that's going to be implementing qualitative M&E, another event in September around data analysis. So keep an eye out on the FSN newsletter, which will have those events will be posted in the newsletter. So thank you. I want to thank everybody for coming, and thanks, and have a great rest of your day.